I will start with just an acknowledgement of the fact that we are on Lekwungen and Chaseten lands, that we're really very fortunate to be able to live, work, and play on these lands. The Royal Roads community has been fortunate to have good relations with the folks from the Chaseten and Lekwungen families, and that we hope that we continue to be able to have good relations with them going forward. I've been a visitor on these lands myself for about 8 years now. Prior to that, I came from Treaty 7 lands, and my ancestors came to Turtle Island about 4 generations ago. And so I'm definitely aware of the privilege and the benefits that I've inherited because of the history of colonialism. And so it's also very much important to acknowledge those privileges before we start the discussion as well. So I will turn it over to our student volunteers who will introduce the panel this morning. And I want to just say thank you so much for everyone that has come out today to join us, and thanks to everyone who's helped organize this session, and especially thanks to Jasmine and Gio. Russ, you always get a great amount of gratitude from me, but Jasmine and Gio, up until about 6 o'clock last night, didn't realize that they would be here speaking this morning. So it is a great gratitude to you two to join us today. Thank you. And and is it Ali or Alexis, if you want to just take over? Thank you.
Yes, Chase, thank you. And thank you to everyone for attending this morning. We are so excited to begin this 2-day event. And what better way to begin than with this incredible session: Story, Engagement, and Relationality, Perspectives on Indigenous Curriculum, Research, and Pedagogy with Russ Johnston, Jasmine Dionne, Takach, and Chaseten Remillard. I will just start by introducing our hosts. Russ Johnston is the Director of Indigenous Education at Royal Roads University. Russ's background includes work in Indigenous community research, entrepreneurial consulting, sustainable economic development, and cultural protocol education. His scholarly work navigates the intersection of emotional cognizance and traditional knowledge systems rooted in personal, familial, and communal well-being. Jasmine Feather Dionne is Korean Métis from Saskatchewan, an area known for its boreal forests, and refers to the Indigenous nations located in and around northeastern Alberta. Born and raised in Fort McMurray, Alberta, Jasmine left home to pursue studies. Her research objectives are inspired by her home territory. Jasmine Dionne is a Trudeau Scholar and PhD candidate in political science at the University of Victoria. Okay, just one moment. We have some technical issues, so my colleague is going to hop on mic.
My name is Alexis Otley, just hopping on Ali's computer here, and I'll be introducing Gio Takach to begin. So Gio is the professor and program head of the Bachelor of Arts in Professional Communications here at Royal Roads. Gio's research focuses on environmental communication. His current research explores intersections of environmental communication, arts-based research, and Indigenous approaches, and raising awareness and eyebrows at how climate change is and can be framed in public discourse. Gio's extensive work as a professional communicator, writer, and documentary filmmaker spans hundreds of publications and speeches, print, books, magazines, newspaper, and corporate fare. He is also a professional speaker, a wonderful joke teller as well, might I add. He has taught and supervised both undergraduate and graduate students. He leads workshops on varied aspects of communication for the public, private, and has been profiled in local and national media. Please give a warm welcome to Gio. I'm also going to be introducing Chase, who graciously opened this session as well. Chaseten Remillard is an associate professor, program head, and master of arts in professional communications here at Royal Roads. He is a communications scholar interested in questions of social and environmental justice with expertise in visual and professional communications. Prior to joining Royal Roads, Remillard taught communications at both the University of Calgary and Mount Royal University. He was nominated for a University of Calgary Teaching Award in 2009. He also earned a joint honors BA in History and English Literature from McGill University and subsequently completed his master's and PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Calgary. Thank you, and we want to welcome and start the session. We appreciate all who have come, and please enjoy the upcoming speakers.
Thank you for that opening. And Russ, shall we begin the conversation?
Yeah, good morning. It took me a second to pin all of your wonderful faces onto my screen. So it's good to see you. Maybe we'll take this chance just to individually introduce ourselves in the ways that we would like to as we locate here in our spaces and we begin this conversation. Before I do that, actually, I'll introduce myself. So Ani Bojo, Shungila Waha, Indigenous, Neoshindigaming, Indujaba, Wabazishi, and Dodem, Abitanka Subsum Lakwanganaki. My English name is Russell Johnston, and I have the honor and the privilege of being the Director of Indigenous Education at Royal Roads University. I've been a visitor on the lands of the Lekwungen and Kasupsun peoples now for just over 8 years, and there's not a single day that goes by that I'm not in awe of the place that I get to be. I'm sitting in my office right now in the Esquimalt Lagoon, looking at the snow-covered mountains across the waterways. And it's in these times, in these spaces, that I think of what are my responsibilities as a visitor here in these lands and these spaces. And part of that responsibility is thinking about my relationship to these places, these ancestors and these families, and thinking about how we can create environments for those generations yet to come. And that's what I'm thankful for, to be a member of the Royal Roads community and to be in spaces where I have the opportunity to chat with folks like Chase and Jasmine and Gio. And so we'll get into a little bit more of what it means to be in conversation, to be in relation, to think about how those ways of thinking and being can shift the environments with which we all engage, not only at work, but also beyond. So I'm going to pass it over to Gio to introduce himself in whatever way he feels. Good morning, Gio.
Good morning, Russ. Thank you very much for the introduction. Delighted to see so many people here. Thanks to everybody involved in the conversation. Thanks to the Koswepson and Lekwungen ancestors and families for stewarding this landscape so honorably and magnificently so that our university could be here for better or worse from a colonization perspective. Royal Roads is the name itself bespeaks of a colonialist institution. One that has impressed me in its good-hearted efforts to begin to address the ravages of colonization. And there's recommendation 86 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which applies directly to so-called media schools, but that's certainly something that Chase and I and our colleagues in the School of Communication and Culture, your hosts of this conference, have embraced. I myself am the first in the known history of my family to be born outside of what is perhaps tied with Poland for the most colonized country in a continent that has done such a fabulous job of that practice, Europe. My parents risked their lives to flee Hungary coming to Canada as political refugees and hatching me as a freedom project, I suspect, some years after their arrival. So I have a complicated relationship with colonization, because in fleeing then Soviet regime occupying Hungary, they came to Canada and became, I guess, colonizers in their own right. And I'm very, very grateful for the opportunities that Royal Roads has created, the spaces that it has created, the people like Russ and Jasmine that are part of our community, that are helping us in the important work that we all have to do in areas such as decolonization and indigenization, and just generally trying to do a better job of respecting the earth and her first peoples. I will now turn it over to Jasmine to introduce herself.
Thank you. I'm Jasmine Dionne. My paternal grandfather is Métis, and my paternal grandmother is Cree. And so my father is Cree and Métis, and my mother is a Turkish settler who immigrated and settled in Ottawa when she was 10 years old. And as a result, I want to acknowledge a lot of the intersections through which I also have power. I'm occupying the territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich families, and territories that I have been an uninvited visitor on for about 6 or 7 years now. And I have the immense privilege of existing within multiple academic institutions. And academia does feel like quite a safe space, especially for white, Indigenous people like myself that are phenotypically white and hold a lot of power and a lot of space. And so I want to acknowledge that I am occupying space and territory as I talk to you all today. And I am really excited to be working alongside Russ in Indigenous education, something that has allowed me to really utilize the knowledge that I have gathered in academic settings and institutions, specifically the knowledge I've gained from my PhD that I'm doing at UVic. I feel like I'm really able to put all of that knowledge into motion, which is quite exciting, because a lot of times it can feel like, what do I do with this? And so I'm grateful to share a little bit about some ideas and thoughts that run through my head. So I'll pass that on to Chase to introduce himself.
Okay, so I'm going to be the guy who's like, you're on mute.
There we go. Yeah, so I, as I said, I have been an uninvited guest to the Lekwungen and Chaseten lands here for about 7 or 8 years, and previously was on Treaty 7 lands. My family came to Turtle Island from Europe, about 4 generations ago, and I feel I feel like there might be a little bit different positionalities for each of us, obviously, in terms of our connection to the topic today. I think that from the perspective of program head and academic and researcher, that maybe Geo has done a lot more work in terms of understanding what decolonization is from the perspective of a settler. And so I'm really privileged just to be part of this conversation and to sort of share some of the thoughts that I have and really listen and learn from both from all of the other folks on the panel. So thank you for inviting me, and happy to be here.
Miigwech, everybody, for taking the time and relocating in the ways that you do, and thank you for joining. I suppose myself and in this space this morning. I also want to give gratitude to those that are with us this morning. I always joke that whenever Butch and I have the opportunity to do this, that people are actually just showing up to hear Butch, because he is such an incredible human being, and is always so gracious with his time and his efforts to just be present. And so him not being able to join us was a bit of a surprise, but at the same time too, I was thankful that the conference itself recognized the importance of his communal responsibilities and his roles that he plays and the many hats that he wears as an integrated member of his community. And so for us to shift in this space in the short time that we did speaks to, I think, a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, which is how can engaging in these spaces ripple across not only our institutions but our lives also. And I feel like Butch is still with us in the sense of our topic today, because one of the things that Butch always reiterates when we have the pleasure of being in his presence is how important it is just to visit, just to be present, just to talk, just to communicate. No agendas, no sort of hard line ideas driving, but rather that chance to just be and allow those things to flourish and to nurture and to shift, and to go. And it's one of the things that I always appreciate about sitting around Butch's kitchen table, because next thing you know, you look at your watch and you've just spent 3.5 hours and you've run a gamut of topics and things. And I always leave his space with my mind just spinning a million miles an hour. And one of the things that I've been thankful for over the last little while is that Royal Roads has committed to doing and growing the work around Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous education. And because of that movement forward, I've had the honor and the privilege of getting to know Jasmine, Dionne over the last little while. And one of the things that I am so thankful about getting to know her and being able to spend time with her is it's kind of like Butch's kitchen table. We have afternoons or mornings where we just sit with a coffee and we let the conversation go where it needs to go. And it goes to some, for me, pretty incredible philosophical, in-depth conversations that end up becoming the root of the work that we choose to take on within Indigenous education, within our curriculum design, within our pedagogy, within the way that we're dreaming new spaces to fruition here at Royal Roads University. And I think it's important for us to think about visiting as a form of methodology, as a form of pedagogy. And this is something that Jasmine has really allowed myself to really embrace and to really think about how those types of conversations unfold in the work that we're doing as we're moving forward. So I'm going to pass it over to Jasmine now to maybe speak to some of those ideas and those concepts.
Yeah, thank you. When I was asked to step in today, the one thing that I felt like I could talk a bit about was visiting and referring back to a talk that I did at the University of Guelph. And at that time, I was thinking about how to apply all of these new ideas that I had learned into my research, and specifically the ideas of visiting, which are the idea of visiting as a methodology, but also as a practice politically within Indigenous communities, comes from the amazing Métis authors Flaminino, Gaudet, and Dorian. And they define or describe visiting as a method of survival, of dialogue and deliberation, decision-making, responsibility, celebration, and sharing and caring for our relatives. It's quite a broad spectrum of practices that can come with various forms of reasoning, including the need to celebrate something or somebody's life, but also when we have those really tough conversations with family members, or when we're able to kind of set boundaries with people through this act of being present, being with them, visiting, but also stating what you need. All of these are quite political practices amongst many Indigenous communities, and as such has warranted the authoring of a paper that highlights that as a methodology. And so when we're talking about visiting in more informal spaces, like the reference to a kitchen table, Sarah Hunt and Cindy Holmes refer to these sort of spaces as activist spaces that aren't really seen as activist spaces because they're not this formalized out in the public with a large group of people who are sort of, stating their collective goal in a very formalized and what we know as protesting or what we know as defense, again, for the protection of Indigenous sovereignty and so forth. But that in intimate spaces of our homes or in our workplaces, in the very informal spaces of even what I refer to as having conversations on long road trips, or the people that you might meet next to you on the plane, these very informal spaces where you're able to come together through story, and what might not be known or what might not be seen when you are having these conversations is that you're setting norms and standards, or you're highlighting what those norms and standards are for how you expect yourself and your community to be treated, how you expect things in the world to change, even if that's a ripple effect from your own community and so forth. It's within these intimate spaces with the people that we're really close with, or the people that we're growing close to, that we're able to have our kind of guard brought down and have very vulnerable conversations that can be quite transformative politically and in the large arena that's of the public sphere that aren't really considered as sort of an activist practice, but they are. And so I kind of take that idea of intimate spaces alongside visiting. And what I also highlight is that there's the notion of deliberative law that John Burroughs has talked about quite extensively. And this is the idea that Indigenous law can also be derived from discussion, debate, and revision. And these are all necessary to maintain and revise Indigenous laws. We know that through conversations, we can highlight when we think that something is unfair, and when we think that the collective goals of the community might have changed, or the needs of the time, considering where we are with the state of active colonial violence and how it shapeshifts and is now existing in a way that's that offers itself in some minute forms through different spaces like the academy or in other institutions. And so we're able to talk about these things and become more aware of our existence within them and how to resist against them when we're able to deliberate and have the sort of intimate communication that we might not get elsewhere. And so thinking about these ideas, I was really drawing on the idea that we really engage in deliberation and intimate forms of communication, and set those standards for what we'd like to see, especially within Indigenous education. We're able to have conversations where we see each other as equals trying to do important work. And when we're able to sort of have that set tone in that environment, we're able to have transformative conversations that allow us to think beyond many of the binaries that are put on Indigenous education across the board in academia. And the idea of being able to visit, it sounds quite like futile or silly to a lot of Western scholarship, but it's in these spaces that we've been able to make the most change. And so usually when we're asked, I have this idea or I have this thought and I want to incorporate traditional knowledge, or I want to incorporate Indigenous scholarship, or I don't really know what I'm doing, but I know that it needs to have Indigenous knowledge placed within it. We're sort of tasked with the idea, at least formally in the Western perspective, that it's kind of a transaction where people would come to an Indigenous educational space and sort of just ask for a little piece of or a nugget of knowledge to be included in the work that they're doing. But they're completely erasing the importance of relationships and relationship building, and also the fact that this knowledge doesn't exist in a vacuum. This knowledge can only come to life when you maintain those relationships that were created in the first place, or should have been created in the first place. And so the practice that we sort of take or have been implementing has been the idea of visiting, especially in its sense of being a space of deliberation, being a space where Indigenous knowledge is at the center and not in the periphery, as well as the notion that we want this space to feel comfortable, like it would be at your kitchen table or on a fun road trip with family. And so it does involve this level of understanding what an intimate, comfortable space would feel like for colleagues, especially within academia. And so part of our practice has been visiting with folks that do have these ideas and questions about how to incorporate or how to center Indigenous knowledge in their curriculum. And it's a quite exciting process to have read about, at least formally, the idea of visiting from those scholars that I mentioned, but then actually putting it into practice in an academic setting. I think it has led us through what for some might feel like a slower process or a slower journey to get to the root of why they had come to us in the first place. But in the long run, it has allowed us to have, again, those very deep philosophical conversations across departments in the university. And it also reflects that Indigenous knowledge is so widespread and so broad. And I think that a lot of times, because we work in silos, that Indigenous studies or Indigenous education is seen to exist on its own. But there are elements of theoretical components from communication, from political science, and so forth that exist within and outside of Indigenous knowledge. And so it's exciting for us to, when we get to communicate in this visiting way with people across the university, that we're able to reflect the scholarship that we know of that intersects with all of these different fields. And that might not be a well-known fact, or might not be something that people were aware of. And so it's quite an illuminating process for us. And in thinking through what kind of norms and standards we want to set as the team of Indigenous education, we're able to really think through how we want that specific team to grow, what we want the university to sort of take into account when we're talking about indigeneity and ontology and all of the important pieces that we add in the Western way, so through a strategic plan or through other formalized documents that do highlight the importance of Indigenous knowledge. But again, we're able to do it in our way when we're visiting. And we really come up with like these very grand dreams of what we'd like to happen. But I think those ideas wouldn't come to life if it weren't for that specific practice. And so in different capacities, we have visited with Geo and Chase. And so I think I could leave this sort of as the opportunity to switch and get them to reflect on those experiences as well. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. I think folks can now see why I enjoy spending as much time in conversation with you as I do. It was important for us today to think about too, not only what this work means to us, but what it means for our community, right? And that's why we're thankful that Chase and Geo have taken the time to join us around this conversation, because we have had the opportunity and the privilege to converse and to work alongside these two gentlemen in these spaces. And maybe this is where I'll shift it over to Chase and ask him perhaps how this method, this way of engaging, this way of being in relation to Jasmine and myself and elders and other folks that you've had the opportunity to be around, has maybe sort of shifted some of your work or has had an influence on your spaces.
You know, sorry, can you hear me? Am I still muted? Okay. You know, Jasmine, you used the phrase visit, and I think, again, I mean, every time, I've only heard you speak a couple of times. I think this is the second time that I've heard you speak, and we've had a few conversations outside. But every time you bring another kind of representation of a process or of a relationship in a different way, and the idea of a visit, I think, is such an interesting and powerful one, because, you know, it kind of taps into something that I've been thinking about in terms of how politics and how policy and how ideology gets kind of manifested and changed over time, because it is through these little interactions that we have with people who we respect and enjoy their company, and these safe spaces that we then can try out or kind of try on different ideas or different positions or different, maybe not identities, but different sort of versions of our own beliefs in a way that doesn't necessarily cause us to feel frightened or concerned about our safety, right? So it's this sort of creation of a safe space that allows us to be able to sort of say things that we might have wanted to say, or ask things that we might have wanted to ask, but that the formal channels, those transactional channels, as you so rightfully said, right? These transactional sort of siloed channels force us to kind of formalize these requests in things like an ethics approval form or a proposal to do research, right? Whereas having a conversation about the potential of doing something or changing something with you or with Russ, in which it's sort of, well, what would that mean? How, you know, what would that look like? How does that forward what you want? What is it that you're, these kind of conversations, I think, from that perspective of like of shifting the mode of inquiry to one like you said, which is about relationality and is about sort of understanding that this isn't just transactional, that there are people on the other side of this, and there's histories to those people and to their people and their people. I think that has had a really profound impact on me as a researcher. I think, like I said to Russ, I said, I don't know if you want me there, because I don't know, I never, like, he said, well, you have 12 hours to reflect on it, because it is something that has happened over the time that I have known Russ, and I'm getting to know you, Jasmine, and it is something that does take time to kind of reflect upon its impact. And I'm grateful for the space. I can think of a couple of conversations that I've had with Russ, because I've had a longer relationship with him, in which a lot of things became much clearer to me after the conversation. And I think that speaks to that power of your methodology of visiting, because it wasn't that I was going to the director of Indigenous education and asking for policy or procedure advice, right? It wasn't that I was sending an email and asking for, it was that I was going to Russ, and that we were having a conversation about something that was happening in my space, and that was something that was happening in his space, and how do those two spaces interact and intersect, and how can we, like, live more in the overlap of those spaces, than instead of the siloed versions of those spaces. So I know I haven't really answered the question with anything but, like, kind of vagaries, but that's sort of where I'm at right now. And I think, Geo has had a much more, probably like a deeper relationship with this, because he's worked very closely with Russ on developing curriculum. So I'll pass it to him to hear, if you don't mind, Russ, to hear what he has to say to your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Chase. It's an honor to be here with the three of you. It's an honor to carry Butch Dick's coffee cup, let alone stand here with you in his time slot with Russ. Jasmine spoke of research by visiting, and I just had to smile from ear to ear when I heard that, because I'm working on in the 5th year of a pandemically poleaxed funded study on communication around intersections of Indigenous, environmental, and arts-based thought in service of improving relations among people, the environment, and First Peoples as well. And in the course of speaking with one of my heroes, a brilliant writer of Cree and Scandinavian extraction from Treaty 1 territory, Warren Cariou, he kind of turned to me and smiled and said, "You know what you're doing right now, Jill?" And I said, "Well, I'm talking with you, Warren." And he said, "Well, you're doing research by visiting." And that was actually the first time I'd heard the term, in the 5th year of a study in which the thing to which I was aspiring had a name, was an Indigenous Métis concept, and had a name. And of course, that's when, I'm now hurrying to read everything I can about it, and learning so much in the process. I just want to give 3 quick riffs, if time permits, of my take on what I've heard and the topic in the immense amount of time we've had to reflect on it, but living the life that the 4 of us do, and the work that we do, we've probably had more time than we think. If we look at communication, the standard Griffin et al. Undergrad communication theory textbook definition of communication, drawing on the old French origins of the word, to bring into common, to connect, a relational process of creating and interpreting messages that elicits a response. And if we look at ethics, the second word in this conference is a set of obligations we adopt based on our morals, values, or ideology. That's just my hack definition. And then we go to another one of my heroes, the Pascagoula Cree scholar, Sean Wilson. He talks about the who is one of our, along with Stan and Peggy Wilson, all related, our inaugural Indigenous scholars in residence here at RRU. He articulates this concept of relational accountability, that we are all accountable as people to those with whom we are in relationship. And if you look at a work another work that has inspired me called Sawak by Umik / Clifford Atleo, he says everyone and everything is related. And so this concept of relationality is very harmonious with the idea of communication, and that which brings us all together here today. First key lesson that I learned is that our society is, of course, obsessed, the dominant society, with results and content, often at the expense of process. And this was brought home to me when it occurred to me that we need a course around communication, engaging Indigenous concepts in our Bachelor of Arts in Professional Communication program here at RRU. So I waited a respectful 2 or 3 days after Russ was hired before I approached him. I wanted him to serve with me on a hiring committee to engage an Indigenous scholar to develop and teach a course around communication in Indigenous contexts was the draft name that I came up with for it. And in fact, the process of discussion that Russ and I had, I'm going to just break in. You have about, I don't know, a day or two or a week or something like that to develop a course. That's the standard amount of time we are given in our work plans at Royal Roads to develop curriculum. Well, 1.5 years of discussion later with Russ, it occurred to me that the process became the content. The process became the product. It was an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous guy coming together to navigate a shared third space. A citizen, Potawatomi Nation scientist and scholar, Robin Wall Kimmerer calls this braiding together different cultures and traditions and ways of knowing and being. The Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall calls it two-eyed seeing. The Sturgeon Lake Cree scholar Willie Ermine says this is an ethical space of engagement. Please note the word ethics there. My surname translated from the Hungarian means weaver, so I like the idea of interweaving. And I'm just going to put here in the chat box for you a recommended book and an article on the idea of interweaving. So through this course that Russ and I birthed, and have taught. We're going into our third iteration this summer. We invite students, both Indigenous and non, to reflect on and experience their own positionality, who they are and where they came from, what they think about their relationship to the lands from which they came and or where they live. And we ask that they do that reflection in light of teachings shared by Indigenous scholars and allies. It has been an absolutely amazing learning experience for our students and certainly for myself as well. So this idea of relationality and relational accountability, and also expressing ourselves through the power of story, whole other separate topic, and I'm going to stop talking, but that would be the next thing I would wish to discuss. But my engagement with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous concepts in service of research and teaching here at our RRU has changed my life, and I like to think for the better. Back to you, Russ.
Oh, great. Thank you, everybody, for taking that time. It's interesting to sit here. As I was sitting here, I received, or just before I came on, I received a text from Peggy Wilson speaking about her wanting to come and visit again. Not so much do work, but to come to visit and to come and be in relation and to be a part of this community. Again, even though they live in the PAW, these days. And so it's always interesting to see the reverberations of that relationality with which we're speaking. And I'm smiling too, because time is an interesting concept with this idea, and Gio sort of touched on it too. You know, I was kind of laughing inside of my head of like, if I realized how long it would take and how much time would go into developing the course that we did, I would have asked for a raise. But at the same time, I'm also really thankful for that process, for that time to not only develop my relationship to what it is that we're putting within that curriculum, but also that time and that effort to be with Gio and to get to know Gio and to have a better relationship with Gio, and what that means for our students when we come together in the way that we do, and that ability to find those spaces of intersection that Chaseten mentioned. You know, Gio comes from the background that he does with the work that he's done, and finding ways to, in Gio's words, interweave those ways of thinking and being is always an interesting game, I guess, because I find myself doing the same thing with Jasmine in our spaces too. You know, it's oh, I didn't think about the way that you brought that up, or I've never, that didn't enter my mind, and all of a sudden my mind is expanding and thinking about ways that with this energy and knowledge generation that we can start and continue to shift the environments that we're engaging. I think the one thing that I want to touch, because I recognize 9:45 is upon us and we'd love to leave some.
This is your 10-minute warning. Just want to let you know.
As if on cue. Is also the communications and the ethics that goes into nonverbal communications. I think we spent a lot of time talking about what our relationships are to each other in this space, but there's also the communication that happens when we allow ourselves to open up and to be vulnerable to what's around us in nonverbal communications. There is this air of, I suppose, confidence or calm when I have the time to sit with Jasmine. I'm not carrying this anxiety, this whatever those things are, those responses are, in a way. And there's this way of just being together that allows for a deeper level of engagement, and maybe to Chase's point around this idea of safe or brave or whatever term we want to associate with that. But I also want to take that sort of one step further. I mentioned this morning that I have the pleasure of having an office with a very beautiful view, and it overlooks the Esquimalt Lagoon and the mountains, like I mentioned. And we have the opportunity to walk the 550 acres that Royal Roads is situated in. And we have some of the most beautiful trees and foliage and plants and medicines and waterfalls and all these sorts of things that exist in this land, in this space. And I think, or am very cognizant of the way I communicate my energy as I walk these lands and these spaces too, but also opening myself up to, what are they communicating to me? What are those things that they're telling me? What are those things that they're gifting me? What are those things that I need to hear and to listen to as I navigate those spaces? And I'm thankful for those opportunities that I get to do those things and to think about how that can be, or how that can emerge within the curriculum and design, how that can emerge in the work that we're doing with our faculty, how that can emerge in the meetings that we have with the executive and all the spaces that I have the privilege of being a part of. And I don't necessarily have any answers to what those are, but what I can do is make the effort to see how those things can manifest in those spaces. And what I'm thankful for is all three of the faces that are pinned to my screen right now I see are doing the same work, have the same vision for shifting, for changing, for growing, for nourishing, and that it takes all of us and all of our skills and all of our gifts and all of our lenses and all of our effort to do those things, and that we can't do these in a silo and we can't do them on our own, and that it takes many hands to shift and to see the change that we want to incorporate into all of our spaces, not just our workspaces, but our family, our communities, our nations, and globally too. And so it's an honor and a privilege to be able to do that work alongside these folks. And I look forward to bringing to fruition all of those dreams and all of those conversations that we get to have. Is this where we open it up to questions in the floor?
We just have one question from our audience. Carrie had asked, saying time is very much a consideration in the workplace, and in particular, when looking to advance public policy. How do you suggest balancing all the time constraints imposed to produce policy, yet needing to engage meaningfully with Indigenous peoples?
Is there anybody that would like to take a shot at this?
I mean, I can share a little bit, but it's probably not going to be like the answer that maybe is wanted. So when I think about public policy, I think about its roots, which were, if we're talking about Canadian public policy, the roots are through the government structures that we know as our federal government, and then our provincial and territorial governments and municipal governments. And so I'm thinking about the root of those. The only reason that they exist is because of colonial violence. And so the intentions through which those structures operate come from very much the same place that they are rooted from, which are the roots of colonial violence. And so I think in response that I understand that there is still a place for public policy in the specific form of government that we have to work either alongside or are trying to eradicate in different measures, but are operating under these structures. So I think the best way that I almost think there isn't really a balance that can be met. I almost think that there is a need, or that the arbiters of public policy must always and continually follow the duty to consult, and that duty to consult will take however long it needs to take. Indigenous communities are at capacity across the board, especially when we think about the ongoing legacies of colonial violence that these communities continue to exist within and under. And so I think if there is room for that sort of time to be not balanced, but sort of given to the community, that there needs to be adequate time given to anything, because anything that we've seen that has been rushed, particularly in terms of economic development in my territory. I know it was said that I was born and raised in Fort McMurray, and I've seen the results of rushing many forms of public policy that have allowed our lands to be devastated and destroyed. So I think the immediate response that I thought of to that question was duty to consult, takes however long it needs to take. And that's sort of where I'll leave that. But if anyone else has answers, please jump in.
I'm just going to riff off maybe more so the concept of time, right? Like if we're thinking about this time as this hardline thing, I think the thing that needs perhaps that we do have control over is our relationship to it, right? And I think that ties into how we conceive work, right? And how we value what certain things are or could be. You know, I think maybe part of the answer, or perhaps what could be an aspect of that answer, is valuing the time to be together, the time to consult as being, or if not more important than the policy that's created. And I think there needs to be a rebalancing of how we're in relation to time, because it is the one piece that we do have some control over if we conceive the world in a 24-hour clock, right? Is that we do have the agency to shift our relationship to that time. And I think that's an important piece, is that we do have the power, we do have the agency to shift those ideas and those concepts too.
Thanks, Russ. That puts us just about at time. So I want to thank all of our presenters this morning for their thoughtful comments on this important topic. We're going to resume the conference at 10 a.m. with our next session, which is Restoring Humanity in Turbulent Times. This session and all of the conference sessions are being recorded and will be sent out to all of the people who have registered. So if you can't stay for the rest of today, although you should, it's going to be great. You'll be able to watch and catch up with that later. So we're just going to break for about 5 minutes and then we'll be back at 10 a.m. Thank you, everyone.